Good evening. Welcome again to Captions. I'm Andre Bohannon, your host, and this is a program where we talk about the what, the where, the when, the who, and the why. Tonight we're going to be having some very important discussions with some individuals that you may not recognize, and hopefully in our first case you will not have had to have any direct contact. I have with me Peoria Chief of Police, Steve Settingsgaard. Chief, welcome to Captions.
Thank you.
From following the newspapers and following what's happening on TV, you must be one of the hardest working department heads at the city of Peoria during these past summer months. Am I almost correct there?
Yeah, I would think so. You know, the summer's always busy for us, and you know, the last week or so has been really busy for us. You know, we had a bad tragedy this week that we're dealing with.
Yes, and that was the case of a young man who was home sleeping, being shot, and dying as a result of one of our so-called drive-by shootings. Am I correct?
That is correct. An 8-year-old boy.
That is tragic. But as I tell my friends, you know, we kind of paused because it was an 8-year-old boy, but it wouldn't have mattered had it been a 68-year-old grandmother or any other innocent person in the home who died. But when we take away one of our young people, whether he's 8 years old, 12 years old, or whatever, they're at the start of their life, and it's really tragic that because of what I call some real ignorant actions of a few people. And again, I think the people that are committing these crimes don't represent the total community. They certainly don't represent all of the African American community where a lot of the so-called crime is taking place. Are there any special things that in anticipation to summer, which does appear to be a time when there's a lot of so-called street violence, whether it's in terms of shooting or robbery or other, that you have brought into being in terms of the chief of police to try to curb some of that or control it?
We do, Andre. The council each year has apportioned a piece of money for what we call saturation patrol. So from spring through fall, we put out extra resources on the street in areas of the city that have recently had the most or highest degree of crime or violent crime. You know, we put out extra officers on overtime and two-man cars and really try and get on top of things when as they're heating up. And every summer, you know, things get a little busier for us. It's just a human nature. We go out, we spend more time outside in the summer. Right. You know, we're more active in the summer, and unfortunately, you know, some of the folks you were talking about, the irresponsible ones, the crooks, they get a little more active too. Yeah,
and in a sense, they kind of take over neighborhoods because the average citizen is afraid to go out, afraid to almost let their kids go out anymore, and that's a real turnaround when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I'd probably be outside after breakfast all the way until evening, playing ball or going to the park or just doing little neighborhood type of things. And because of all of the violence that's going on and people snatching kids and sex offenders and that type of a thing, look like the good people are staying inside, which only leaves the corners and the streets to the so-called thuggish type people. I think to some degree that's what happens, and I know we have these special efforts taking back the neighborhoods and those kinds of things. My personal feeling is that we cannot have a policeman on every corner, on every block, and so we need to participate along with you and increase our own surveillance of looking out the window, seeing what's going on, or hopefully sitting on the porch and observing things. What are your thoughts about the participation as far as citizens in the neighborhood or in the community in general? Does it take that type of a...
Oh, it does. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. We can't be on every corner, and even if we had a police officer on every corner, you know, you still have blocks in between the corners where things are going on. We just can't be there for everything. It really does take, and it sounds cliche, but it does take a community. And you mentioned something that's troubling, and I believe you're right, that that we don't go outside like we used to when you were a child, even when I was a child. You know, I remember my mother would kick us out of the house in the morning, and she didn't want to see us back in the house till dinner time.
Absolutely.
But we have a perception now that kids are being snatched by strangers, and all these things are happening. And I think we've kind of shuttered our doors and windows, and we stay inside. I think some of that is more perception than reality. And I think that a lot of the reason that some of the hoodlums in our neighborhood think they own the neighborhood is because we've given it away. All the good people that live on that block, and as you know, most of the people on any given block are good people.
Right.
We need to be bolder. Those folks need to be bolder and outside, know their neighbors, and challenge behavior that's inappropriate. And that's kind of the thing we've been pushing for the last several years, for people to be, I don't know if aggressive is the right word, maybe assertive, to, when you see someone out on your block doesn't belong or acting foolish, challenge that behavior.
Well, part of the problem that we don't even know who doesn't belong because neighbors aren't neighborly anymore. I could probably stop the average citizen and they can tell me 5 players for the Cubs or on the Chicago Bears, but they can't name by name 5 neighbors that within either across the street or next door. We need to become more customer friendly. We need to become more neighborhood friendly. I think maybe another thing that contributes to it is air conditioning. We used to be outside when I was growing up, including the adults, because it was too hot to be in the house. Now it's too hot to be out of the house. And maybe that also contributes to the fact that we don't have people outside like we used to have when we were growing up, as well as waving across the fence or seeing the person next door with a garden and you go and talk to them and that type of a thing. We really need to connect within our neighborhood. And the other thing that unfortunately is happening today is this thing called don't want to be a snitch. Well, do you have any comments about this so-called thing called snitching, where people who don't want to cooperate with the police, particularly when they do see something? And that's relatively new. That never happened when I was around. In fact, there was no such thing as a snitching. You have any comments about what citizens can do, and what is our responsibility and our obligation to do? Again, it's not snitching, which kind of implies that you're telling something on somebody and don't want to get them in trouble. We want some of these folks that are doing the wrong thing not only to get in trouble, but to get in serious trouble, if necessary, to be incarcerated. And again, you're innocent until you're proven guilty. And if you're innocent, nothing will happen. But if you're guilty, something should happen.
It is part of our problem, Andre, that, I think when we were kids, and especially you were a child earlier than I was, snitching in those days was just telling on your brother for taking cookies out of the cookie jar or something.
Absolutely.
But, today it has become there's a cultural phenomenon that you don't snitch on anyone. But what happens is, let's say a fellow does a shooting, and it doesn't have to be as egregious as this shooting of this 8-year-old child, but it could be just shooting up a house or shooting up a car or shooting someone in the leg, and people see that, and as part of this code of don't snitch, they don't report it. Well, that shooter then doesn't go to jail, and he doesn't get prosecuted, which means he's on the street to do more violence, and someone's his next victim, and that's, I guess people probably are thinking it's not going to be me, it's not going to be my house or my child, but someone's going to be the next victim that could have been prevented. Some of these guys need to be locked up. They're stone cold killers, and in this case of this 8-year-old, we are getting some calls. We're getting some calls through Crime Stoppers. We're getting some calls into the police department, and we're getting some information is, quite frankly, just rumor, but what we're hearing kind of confirms what we're thinking as possibilities, and we haven't gotten that one great tip yet that breaks the case, but I'm hoping we're going to get it. People do need to call. You need to protect your own, protect your neighbors. We've got to get rid of these predators. We've got to get them out of the neighborhoods. And you mentioned about people not knowing their neighbors. you know, we need to be more active. Most neighborhoods now have a neighborhood association.
Great.
And that's really a good place to get to know your neighbors. But some of them struggle to get people to show up and be involved. And you are right. That's part of the equation. That's how to take back our neighborhood is to one, know your neighbors.
Right.
And then you know who doesn't belong. And then you feel some strength in numbers that, you know, if you know that out of the 25 houses on both sides of your block, 24 of them are good families, you feel strength in those numbers. And maybe you got one bad family there that.
Well, again, I can recall when I was growing up, and I was in the 50s, so that was quite a while ago, when my parents and I would leave town, we'd let our neighbors know. Today, the mentality is, I'm afraid to let my neighbors know because that'd probably be the one that break into my house and that type of a thing. You mentioned the thing about Crime Stoppers. When I was growing up, there was no such thing as Crime Stoppers. We stopped crime by either reporting, by sharing information, or in many cases it was a young person by contacting the parent and said, hey, I saw your son in somebody's garage taking a bicycle and that kind of a thing. Right. Also, there was no such thing as a curfew. The curfew was called mom and dad, who knew where the kids were and demanded that at certain times of night they had to be home. It didn't take an officer to have to bring a kid home or write up a kid by a city council with an ordinance. So many things have changed in terms of the responsibility that people took on. Today, we depend too much on our law enforcement officers to enforce law, when I know you know that it takes all of us to enforce laws. And in many cases, we had behavioral problems, loud music in cars. They didn't have to have an ordinance to prohibit that. You just knew you didn't play your radio in cars that loud, although probably back in those days we didn't have all of those kinds of speakers that would probably be that loud.
Right.
But I mean, society, in my mind, has really changed, and that has really contributed to the breakdown of our so-called law and order. And then the ones who are breaking the law, we're in a sense not letting them deal with the problems of law because we don't want to, quote, snitch. And anything that you would like to tell our viewers that might be of some assistance in terms of what they can do or what they shouldn't be doing to help you? About how many law enforcement officers do we now have here in Peoria?
We have 214 in the city of Peoria.
And I would assume that has to be our largest department in terms of city government and probably our most expensive department.
It is. It's smaller than it was 2 years ago. We were at 250, but it's still the single largest department and the most costly department, for sure. You asked what can we do. It does go back to the providing information and sharing with your neighbors and you know, starting from little things. You know, you mentioned you know, when you were young, if you acted up in the neighborhood, you know, your parents got a call.
Absolutely.
And then if your parents were like my parents, they didn't go to the caller and defend you and say you wouldn't do that. You caught it, right?
Oh,
you caught it from mom or dad, and whatever the neighbor said they believed. Over my version they believed it. So, but now we kind of transitioned into this period where, one, we defend our children at all costs, and a lot of times neighbors won't call because they end up getting threatened, or they get, you know, mom or dad comes over and is threatening them for calling about their child. So we need to get back to that, and for these violent crimes in Peoria, we need a a new momentum.
Yes, we do.
We need people to understand that we got to get these killers out of our neighborhood, because none of us should want them. And you know, I'm a believer in what Carl Cannon does. You know, he helps reform and turn kids around, and kids come from tough backgrounds. But he acknowledges that we have some folks in our community that there just is no answer other than we got to lock them up, and it's unfortunate. And they can get locked up, and you know, they can come to Jesus in prison. They can turn their lives around, and I believe we give them a chance when they come out. But some of these folks are dangerous, and again, if you're not snitching, if you're not giving us information because you're afraid, the thing to be afraid of is this fella not getting locked up.
Well, in my opinion, even though he has a formal program, we all can be a Carl Cannon. We all can show interest in our youth in our own way.
Yeah.
If you know the little boy across the street, and if he has no father or a male figure, in a sense, you could become that male figure. But today we're afraid to let the man down the street even get involved with our kids because we don't know the man down the street. And he may be the one to take our son fishing, or if he's a golfer, say, hey son, have you ever played golf, or those kinds of things, because those were the things that happened when I was around. Our entire neighborhood, in a sense, was an elite program. There were many Carl Cannons. They were called our neighbors. They were called our uncles. They were called our brother-in-laws and things of that type. Right. That even as a family, we need to become more supportive, particularly to young people, to cause them to walk the straight line. Because when I was coming along, there were a lot of men that may have been absent from the family because they were in war, right, or they had died or whatever. But the kid didn't suffer from a void because there was another male, whether it was a relative, an uncle, the man next door or across the street, showed interest, encouraged kids, rewarded kids. When the kid would say, hey, Mr. Jones, I made the basketball team, or I made the honor roll. And that kind of encouragement always kept me and other people on the positive note. And today we don't have that system. We don't have the safety net. We're depending too much on too many others, whether it's the police, whether it's the school teacher, whether it's a program like Elite or an Urban League or Boys and Girls Club. Those are good to have, and none of those things existed when I was coming along. But we had neighbors, we had family, we had ministers, we had other people who took an interest, and that's what we really need to do as far as our youth program. But in my opinion, a lot of the crimes that are being committed, even though it's characterized and stereotyped as youth, these are grown men who are doing a lot of these shootings and a lot of the crime that's going on. And in their case, I don't know whether incarceration is the answer, but it certainly is deserved by people who do wrong. But by mixing with other so-called criminals, to me, isn't always the best way to clean up your act, because they think that now they're in graduate school.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
I mean,
really.
They're sitting next door in a cell next to somebody who didn't just shoot 2 people, but shot 5 and bragging about it and that type of thing. So as a society, I think we have a societal problem, and I think all of us, in our own way, cannot just point the fingers at, well, what's the chief doing, or what's the police doing, or what's the council doing. They need to look in the mirror and ask themselves, what am I doing to make, first of all, my home accountable? Do I know where my kid is at this moment? In fact, while they're watching the show tonight, do you know where your kid is? Do you know who they're running around with? Those kinds of things. And then begin to notice what's going on in the street, so that if they turn on their porch light, in many cases, that'll run off the person who's getting ready to do something in the dark, and those kinds of things. Well, again, I don't want to do all the talking, because that's why I wanted you on here to share information, to ask how the community is willing to get involved, and to let them know what they can do to make a real difference.
Well, you made a great point, Andre. And, you know, because if you try and solve the world's problems, the world's problems are big and overwhelming, and sometimes we get overwhelmed and try and do, we worry about too much. If all you did was find some young man to impact his life, whether it's your own son or your nephew or a grandson or your neighbor's son, if you could just make a difference in one young boy's life, and I say boy because typically it's a male issue. We've got some girls that have gone astray, but
Yes.
It's still predominantly a male problem.
Mm-hmm.
If you can change one boy's life, you'll have made a difference, and,
Yes.
and maybe generational, his children and their children.
Mm-hmm.
You're absolutely right, and the elite programs and many of these things that are going on have, they're serving as substitutes for good parenting.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure Carl would love to be put out of business. I'm sure he would love for us as a culture to change, some of these practices that we've transitioned into, and get back more to the day that where the child in your class that didn't have a father or didn't know his father is the exception and not a common thing. I'm sure he'd love to be out of business, and I think it's hard to give a simple reason for the crime or some of the breakdown in our communities. But I think if you had to pick one thing, it's that we've lost our core family structure.
Absolutely.
And not enough dads involved in their children's lives. And so we got a lot of young men that are looking for answers out in the street, looking for love.
And that doesn't cost us anything, Chief.
Yeah.
We talk about our taxes are going up, but at the same time, we want our programs to go up. We want more police, and you're already saying that you're one of the highest cost of government. And in a sense, as I said, we could start being police by being accountable for our own kids and our own behavior. We shouldn't have to pay other people. I mean, it's kind of like the Head Start program, where we want to pay a program to do what, when I was coming along, I had to learn how to read, or I had somebody to teach me how to read, but I recognized and I realized the value of a Head Start program. But we want somebody in our lives pretty much doing things that, in a sense, we ought to do, we're responsible for doing. And you talk about cutting the cost of government and the debt ceiling and all of those things. That's simply because we're not being responsible or accountable as relates to our children, as relates to our neighborhood. Now we've got to have a zoning inspector come out, environmental inspector, to talk about cutting the grass and stuff like that. Well, grass was cut, if it was by me, when my dad would say, hey, go down there and see Mrs. Jones and get her lawnmower. If she doesn't have one, come and get ours, and cut the grass. And I wasn't expected to get paid for cutting Mrs. Jones. But my dad gave me an allowance, and that was one of my responsibilities. And we need to do that as it relates to our kids, to get them involved in doing things wrong. I would never tell my dad when I was growing up, I'm bored. My dad would come up with a list of things, and today, our kids supposedly are bored, so they hang out. And when you hang out, you get involved with other kids, and unfortunately, groups of kids many times will do things that an individual kid would not even think about doing or dare doing. And so
absolutely.
I want to encourage you to continue the positive leadership that I personally feel that you've brought to our community since you've been here. About how many years have you been here now?
6 years.
About 6 years, okay. Well, your predecessor I knew very, very well, John, and I think that for the most part we have a very professional police department, and we can even be more successful as a police department if we increased it by over 100,000 people called Peorians, who saw to it that, first of all, they don't do the wrong thing, they don't allow the kids to do the wrong thing, and when something is going on that's wrong, that they become part of your attempt to solve our crimes in our area.
That would be a blessing, Andre.
Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank the Carl Cannons. I want to thank anybody and everybody who's particularly involved in our youth, as well as those that are working with our adults. In fact, we're going to be in our next segment talking with Agbera Bryson, who's working with some young men who have chosen to go the right path of college and going to ICC, and some programs that he has in place to assist them who may be the first, if not the only person in their family who's attempted to go to college. So thank you for dropping by, and I want to extend to you an invitation that anytime you want to use CAPtions to plead to our community for help, or to explain any special efforts or programs, or just kind of give an update in terms of what's going on in Peoria, please come back, okay?
Appreciate the offer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And we will be right back, and we're going to be talking next to Ag Bear Bryson and some young men who are part of our effort to do the positive thing here in Peoria. Please stay tuned. Call if you have a young person in your house or outside of your house. Get on the phone. Tell them, turn to Captions, Channel 22, right away. We'll be right back.